I'm Julianna Forlano. I'm the host of this panel. I host a show on WBAI called The Julianna Forlano Show. It's news. And I occasionally interview Dr. Wolff for all of his insight about the economy and how it affects things like political activism. I work for ACT TV. If you don't know ACT TV, we basically live stream marches and rallies that are happening in New York City, Washington, D.C., and Los Angeles, because that's where we have correspondents. If we had correspondents in other cities, we might live stream those as well. But we're basically just bringing the message of protesters to a wider audience. We have about 1 million subscribers, which is really exciting to bring. You know, there could be 8 people in the street. I went to a wonderful demonstration at Christmas time, 8 people singing anti-capitalist Christmas songs in front of the Wall Street Christmas tree lighting with the Rockettes in the background, and 500,000 people watched, and it was fabulous. So 8 people in the street can be a big deal. If you are having a protest or a march or a rally in New York, please find me and let me know, and I'll see if I can bring the team down with the cameras. Without further ado, obviously on our panel, the people you've come to see and know and love. To my right, Harriet Fraad, hypnotherapist and mental health therapist in private practice in New York City, founding mother of the Women's Liberation Movement, political activist, writer. I'm sure you know who she is. Let's give her a welcome for being here today. And to her right is Professor Richard Wolff, host of Economic Update, former professor, or I guess they don't call him former anymore, right? You weren't fired. Was Professor Emeritus from Amherst, University of Massachusetts at Amherst, am I getting this right? And currently teaching at the New School here in New York City, here to talk about the American family and what's happening in that front. I believe Harriet's going to go first. Is that right? Oh, sorry, Richard is going to go first. So let's give him a warm welcome as well.
If you're cold, snuggle. It's okay.
So that's about the family, so snuggling kind of fits. I hope it fits. Okay. So I want to start by reminding you of a section of the Communist Manifesto that Karl Marx wrote 150 or whatever it is now, 170 years ago. He was stung at that time when he was writing that by an attack made against radicals, leftists, socialists. Not that many people used that language quite then. In fact, he was a bit daring even by using the word communist in the name of the manifesto he wrote. But people were attacking leftists those days on the grounds that, quote unquote, they are against the family. That if communists were in power, they would destroy the family. They are anti-family. I tell you that for 2 reasons. One, the sad reality that you also live in a society right now where the right wing likes to attack people like us as lacking family values. So something hasn't changed. And Marx's answer hasn't changed either. Marx's answer was, you accuse us of destroying the family? You must be kidding. We are not in a position to destroy their family. You've already done that. And what he meant was, you have put the proletarians of the world into situations where any family-type relationship is unobtainable and unsustainable. You're the perpetrator of the destruction of the family, not us. Keep in mind, though, that he had to face the fact that the people who had destroyed the family by creating economic conditions that made family unsurvivable had somehow blamed somebody else, namely them. And I'm now going to tell you a story of how pretty much the same thing is being done here and has been for 30 years, maybe 40, maybe 50. Okay, it starts here in the 1970s. This is a stylized story, so I'm not going to get all the details, but the basic story. For most of the years from 45 to 75, those 30 years after World War II, the United States economy was in a very peculiar situation. All the other capitalist countries of the world were destroyed. They couldn't compete. They couldn't produce anything. They had had horrific war on their country, whereas we had none, excepting Pearl Harbor, and that didn't do the damage that was suffered in France or Germany or Russia or any of the other countries that we would compete with. And so it was possible for the United States to produce for everybody, and therefore to pay rising wages because they could charge whatever they needed to recoup the rising wage. For those of you who don't know, the Marshall Plan that helped Europe had a little detail in it. We're going to give you all this money, you in Europe and elsewhere, on condition that you buy American products at whatever price the American producer chose to charge. We therefore ripped the Europeans off, made a huge amount of money, and were able to tell our workers, you don't need to be left-wingers or radicals, because in the 30s they were, because we'll raise your wages without class struggle. Because we don't have to pay, we have those Europeans flat on their back. The important thing is that for those 30 years, American workers could be given what they had, not quite to the same degree, but enjoyed even earlier, what came to be called a family wage. Basically enough money to allow the woman, the wife, the mother, to stay at home, raise the children. Of course, poorer people couldn't have that luxury. Non-white people particularly could not have that luxury. But a lot of white people did. And then this lovely 30-year period, 1945 to 75, came to an end. The Europeans had the bad taste to rebuild their economies. The Japanese, equally, the bad taste to rebuild their economies. And of course, being capitalist economies, they knew who they had to beat. They had to beat the United States. They had to produce what the United States produced, either better quality or a cheaper price, or best of all, both. Otherwise, they'd have no chance. In a world dominated by the United States, militarily, politically, culturally, if you're going to succeed as a capitalist in Japan or Germany or anywhere else, you better outdo the Americans. So they set themselves to do that, and by and large, they did. So by the 1970s, Americans were trading in their Fords and Chevys and buying VWs and eventually Hondas, and you know the rest. The United States could no longer get away with the game for those first 30 years. It had to change the game. And the 1970s was the time when the game got changed. And the basic change of the game was no more wage increases. We're going to compete with these foreigners, and we're going to do it by taking it out on you, the American working class. That's always the first choice. But not just that. We're going to do a multi-pronged effort. We're going to start using technology in a way we hadn't before, replacing expensive workers, which is a double benefit because not only do you save money on the worker you replace with a machine, but you make that worker compete with the remaining workers, driving down the wages. It's a nice twofer. And so they did that. And finally, when neither of those strategies were available, they went to more steps. One, they moved the jobs out of the country to where the wages were cheap, and they moved the cheap workers from whatever country they were in here to have them available here and to press down the wages, all of which worked out real well. In short, the problems of capitalist enterprises starting in the 1970s were solved by ripping off two other institutions in our society. The first one was the state. I won't go through it all with you, but you do know 1970s is when we begin to have what came to be called the tax revolt of the American people. The reality was slashing the government. Mr. Reagan is the moment when you go from government as the solution to the problems of a depressed economy that comes out of the Depression into government is the problem, not the solution. And the solution is to get rid of the government, cut the taxes, cut government spending, the mantra of the Republican Party and much of the Democratic Party ever since. So the capitalists are going to solve their problem by attacking the state so they don't have to pay taxes. The culmination of that, the tax cut of last December, 2017, which caps 40 years of reducing the burden on corporations by reducing it some more. Attack the government, immobilize the government. But I said there were two institutions. What was the other institution that the capitalists attacked in order to solve their problems? And the answer is the family. When the wages go down because you have technological change, export of job, bringing in immigrants, when you do that, it's no longer possible, particularly for the white male, keep that in your head, to have a salary that can sustain the white female at home, being the homemaker, the mother, the emotional center of the family, etc., etc. She can't do that because you can't sustain your standard of living. The thing you've promised to one another when you got married, the thing you've promised to your children, you can't afford it anymore. For those of you who don't know, the real wage that had been rising for 100 years in this country before the 1970s stopped rising. It hasn't risen since. The real wage didn't go up anymore. Meanwhile, the name of what an American dream to a family meant kept rising. No way out. So what did American families do when they couldn't do this anymore? When the capitalist system said, we're going to save the profits of business and we're going to stick it to the government and we're going to stick it to the family. Families did two things in response to this attack. They didn't want to give up the American dream. They didn't want to. They had been told that that was their birthright. That was the American experience. That was the uniqueness, the exceptionalism of America, all of that. So American families tried to hold on in this impossible situation. So they did two things. Number one, they did more hours of work. More people in the family took jobs, and if they had a job, they did a second job or more hours. And the second thing they did, because it wasn't enough to take more hours, well, if your wages are going nowhere, but you have to spend more money, then that woman has to go out to work. No more homemaker, mother, out. If you want to call that liberation, fine. That's like when you don't eat meat anymore and you switch from hamburger to hamburger helper and you tell yourself it's because of your diet. Doesn't mean it isn't true, but it means you're using a cover for something whose other reality you don't quite want to see. So Americans not only did more work to hold on to the American dream, but they sent the wife out. And when that wasn't enough, and it wasn't basically because when the wife goes out to work, the family has new expenses it didn't have before. She has to have a whole nother set of clothes for the job. And they maybe have to get another car in a country whose public transportation is as crappy as ours is, et cetera, et cetera. So the families did that last thing. They borrowed money like no working class has ever borrowed money before. We became pioneers, only not this time in a covered wagon going across the prairie. We became pioneers in a level of socialized consumer debt that is still the model for the world. Homeowner debt, car debt, credit card debt, and in the last 20 years, an added one, student debt. Fantastic. Load the population up. The only way you can now get that American dream is if you're working your ass off all the time and you're anxiety-ridden because of debts you know you can't pay. Of course you destroy the family. Are you kidding? Either one of those would have been enough, the combination, a knockout blow. Nobody's home enough. Everybody's catching a bit of yogurt on the way home as a substitute for a family dinner, right? Should be familiar to all of you. The family as an institution is destroyed over the last 40 years. Think about the difference between television programs, for those of you who've had a chance to look at them, that are 40 years old. The lovely husband going out to work with the briefcase and the tie, and the lovely wife at home who's waiting for his return as she grooms Spot the dog and plays with Dick and Jane on the lawn, waiting for Daddy to come home. Isn't this charming? And the little foibles as they lead their wonderfully wonder-bred lives. Now fast forward 30 years, and what do you get? The dysfunctional family. The wife who makes jokes about the sexual inadequacy of the husband who repays her in kind. The children who roll their eyes, clearly understanding that their parents couldn't possibly have done what brought them into the world by the very nature of their awkward incompatibility. It's a cultural transformation, but it mirrors the economic reality. The family is done. Many of you are the products of these families. I don't want to upset you, but you already know that. As Harriet Fraad will tell you, the signs of it in people's decisions about whether or not to get married, whether or not to have children, it's already there. You already know it. You already know it. So let me conclude by telling you what the consequences are of the destruction of the family because it was needed by a capitalist system at a certain time to solve its problems that way. First, there was a genius appropriation of this process by the Republican Party in the United States, and the complete missing of what's going on by the Democratic Party, which, if you follow politics, shouldn't surprise you. This is a repetition over and over again, right up to the present. Here's what the Republican Party understood. Having helped the capitalists more than the Democrats to carry through all of these steps, cutting the taxes of the governments, making the government smaller, weakening the unions, opening the globe for American expansion, all the things Republicans do more than Democrats, and having thereby smashed the family, the Republican Party realized that the way to save this situation for themselves was to position themselves as the champion of family values. That's genius. You destroy an institution, throw people into the horror of living out the destruction of what they had been led to expect, and then you say, vote for us, we'll bring it all back. The Democrats, moving with real skill into the level of complete stupidity, didn't see any of it. Didn't understand what's this family values, hypocritical, missed the whole thing. They thereby got the mass of people suffering what it means to have no family in a very rapacious capitalist universe where you have to work longer hours and you're tired, and the family might have been that haven in a heartless world that Marx once referred to it as. It couldn't function that way. Well, people were distraught. And the Republicans came along and said, yes, the family is under attack, and it's what? They're not going to say it's the capitalists, that's them. So who is it? It's homosexuals. It's homosexuals. And anybody else they could think of other than the capitalist system. Anybody. Democrats, in fact, could be pointed out. So you turn the destruction of the family not only an asset for Republicans, but a loss for the Democrats. Without that move, the Republicans would not have been able to have power in the last 35 years of American society. No Trump, no Bush, none of it. That or Reagan. This is a linchpin. That's why this is so important to understand, of American politics. Last point. There's a Achilles heel of all of this for the Republicans, and I don't want to leave you without making that clear. This embrace of family values has now been split inside the Republican conservative world. It's been split because a subpart of that world wants this to be the celebration not of all family values, but of white people's family values. And by white people's family values, they actually mean white male people's family values. That is, they want the party to become the party of reconstructing the time when, whether it's real or fantasy is really not the point here, but to reconstruct an America in which white men have their white wife back with Dick, Jane, and Spot so that they can come home from their insecure 80-hour-a-week job to enjoy what's left of the lawn in our ecologically mungled culture. But it's a serious image. They're going to bring it back. They have to argue that they're going to bring it back. And therein lies something which, if we're lucky, will be a fatal flaw. Because they can't. They're not bringing it back, not because they wouldn't like to in some fantastic way, but because they cannot. And it is extremely dangerous to sell yourself to the mass of the American people as the deliverer of a package that never comes. You know how you feel about UPS and Amazon when it never comes, after you've paid. Why can't it come? Because nothing is stopping the capitalists from their appointed rounds. They're moving jobs out of the country. They're bringing cheap labor in. All the noise about immigrants is undone as fast as it's passed. It's all political theater. If you pay attention, immigrants are being brought in because the farms can't run without them, because the hospitals need them for the crappy work that's underpaid, all of the other things that Americans can't do. Or if you have Americans doing, which is much more important, they will be so angry and bitter that it's more dangerous for capitalism than to bring the damn immigrants back and live with the tensions that involves. You can't bring it back. You can't deliver. The jobs aren't there, the incomes aren't there, and the capitalists are not playing in this game. Which means the Republicans are working against the clock. They're promising they cannot deliver. Sooner or later, that blows up. And the only real question is whether the left, inside or outside the Democratic Party, assuming that inside they're still there, the question is whether we have the analytic and the organization to expose this story and to offer a whole new way of organizing society that can actually make emotional, personal, intimate, sexual relations among people a priority that the society respects and supports, rather than something thrown away when the difficulties of profitability lead corporations to do all that and let the chips fall where they may. Capitalism destroyed the family. And if that's a problem for you, which it is, then your anger and your hostility ought to go to where the problem starts. And it's not homosexuals. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wolff. Actually, seeing Professor Wolff speak at the Brooklyn Society for Ethical Culture was my foray into really understanding how capitalism was the breakdown of the family. And I am from Syracuse, New York. Anyone else? No?
Upstater.
Upstater. There's always one. Yeah, because no one can live up there anymore because NAFTA destroyed the economies of the entire belt from Buffalo all the way across to Albany. Yeah. Yeah, you could work at a prison, or you could drone people across the ocean from like Syracuse, New York, if you want. Arrest old ladies who are protesting, sorry. The elderly, I don't know, okay. But yeah, so it's always a joy to hear Professor Wolff discussing these things because I think my father's, he was, as I call him, a casualty of NAFTA. He was a working class man, and when he lost his job over and over as those companies started moving out, he became depressed, and that whole cycle of depression just, I think, hastened the end of his life, which, talk about destroying a family, it literally destroyed our family. So I'm very grateful to know Professor Wolff, and I'm also very grateful to know our next speaker, Harriet Fraad. I introduced her earlier, and I think you're really going to enjoy what she has to present. So another round of applause for Harriet.
Thank you very much. Now, what I'm going to talk about is the family in the U.S. Can it be saved, and should it be saved? The family has been presented as a kind of holy organization, a supportive institution that people need in order to develop fully. And developing fully means to be independent of fear and inhibition, to be strong. However, the very premise on which the nuclear family is built is preposterous and makes no sense at all. Just because you could get knocked up or pregnant doesn't mean you could take care of anybody, no less the vulnerable life of an infant that requires 24-hour care. How did we get to that non sequitur? How did we get to presume that the ability to conceive has any relationship to caring for an utterly dependent child, has any ability that goes with conception to be psychologically and intellectually and emotionally fit to bring up children? We've all been taught to believe that. There's no evidence at all. What happened? What about this eternal family? Well, we can go back to the feudal family, which preceded the kind of capitalist nuclear families we have now. None of these family structures, by the way, a little aside, were conceived of and put into practice for the benefit of either parents or children. The idea of the feudal family was to raise future serfs to work for the feudal lord and to create breeders of tomorrow. Catholicism was the ideology that reinforced and justified that family form and servitude as God's will. Our family form, which is a more isolated nuclear family, was born out of the dissolution of feudalism and the feudal family. How did that happen? Well, there's a guy named Jacques Donzelot, who is a French writer of turgid prose, but nonetheless very important book. His book, Policing the Family, traces it meticulously in France. However, there's a parallel progress and process to creating the nuclear family wherever it exists. What its purpose was to save the aristocracy, the remnants of it after the French Revolution, and the new capitalists, as well, the old aristocrats and the Catholic Church, from having to pay taxes to pay for the rearing of children. Part of the demands of the French Revolution were the demand that the state take responsibility for the upbringing of the future citizens who are now children. In the chaos that followed with the dissolution of feudalism, another family form would have to be created, or else the state could be continually pressured, as it was in France at the time, to support and raise children. Because what happened was the feudal lords found it more profitable to raise sheep or cattle on vast tracts of land and kick the feudal families off of the little plots of land that they had farmed in order to give a certain amount for their own survival and the rest to the feudal lord. They were kicked off. Other sons were kicked off because the first son was allocated with the authority of the father and the authority over the land, but you can't subdivide a small piece of land that much. So they migrated off to towns where they could find a life in a town or city. Well, once feudalism was over, thousands and thousands, if not millions of people migrated to cities where there were no holds barred. There were no, the church lost its influence. The feudal father wasn't there to force a marriage on this one and force the penniless one to work on the father's farm. It all dissolved. Men and women were having children. The children were running wild. There was no discipline. And they figured, uh-oh, something has to be done. And Donzelot has the smoking gun on what they did. They arranged meetings of the remnants of the feudal aristocracy that weren't killed in the French Revolution, the members of the church who weren't killed as big landowners and oppressors in the French Revolution, and the wealthy new bourgeoisie that grew up in the towns. And they said, something has to be done, or we're going to have to pay the taxes to raise families. Big crisis. What they came upon, what they discovered and then instituted, was the nuclear family, which gives the man of the family the ability to be the feudal lord of his own little family with total authority. The woman, and also of owning his wife's sexuality. And we have to remember, marital rape was only found illegal in the United States, at least nominally, in 1993. So male ownership of female wives' sexuality is something that lingered for quite a while. However, men also owned their control over their wives' sexuality and their children, and wives got support in childbirth, as long as they didn't work outside the home. After the French Revolution, there was widespread unemployment, and the only people that could be hired are people in that nuclear family configuration, whose wives were home and dependent, and whose husbands were family men. This has lasted a long time. The children were given over as chattel. These arrangements were not made because it's what's best for the fulfillment of parents, no less children, but to keep the feudal aristocracy and the wealthy from having to pay taxes. The children were considered chattel. They didn't need to be rewarded for anything. And really, it wasn't until the 1970s that all the states passed laws against the battered child syndrome, which was written about first in 1962. Before that, in the United States, before 1976, when all states passed laws against child battery, you could bring your dead kid to the emergency room, claim that he or she fell down the stairs or did something else that was an accident, and the hospital was not entitled to accuse you of murder. Now, you didn't brag about, oh, I killed my kid. Certainly it wasn't anything to brag about, but it wasn't illegal. You couldn't serve time for it either. The great Marxist philosopher, Louis Althusser, calls the family one of three ideological state apparatuses, which the state apparatus is something that teaches people how to be submissive and teaches them psychologically from the inside out. Those three ideological state apparatuses were the family, the religion, and authoritarian education that teach children to submit to authority because that's what's being good. Children want to please their parents. If their parents want them to be submissive, which most parents do, they are submissive. They control themselves, particularly in authoritarian families. Children cleave to their parents no matter how violent, narcissistic, or just out to lunch those parents are. Parents who are now in the United States, in the mass of parents who don't have a lot of money, are saddled with the responsibility to know what's best for their children, as they always have been saddled with that when they have no idea. There are no required parenting courses. Children can't speak up and say, actually, what you're doing right now is damaging. Never. They can't even have the brain apparatus to figure it out, no less to make it possible. Children rely almost always on other children to actually see and recognize who they are. When I used to work as a child therapist, one of the red flags in the clinic was children who'd been moved so often they couldn't make friends. And I remember as a therapist, this little girl who'd been raped by her mother's boyfriend when she was 5, crawling into my lap and looking up at me and saying, "Are you sure you're really a grown-up?" Because I recognized her. I felt for her, I played with her, I saw who she was, and it seemed bizarre in her little world. So the family, the nuclear family, which is touted as the grand holy family by the right wing, was never an ideal. It never was. And then the question was, well, should the family be saved? The answer right now is absolutely yes. There is nothing else right now for people. The family is still, even with all its terrible flaws, the most stable emotional support that most people have in our very lonely capitalist society. It should be noted that in England, where there's a public health system, in order to keep the bills down for public health and diseases, they've created a cabinet ministry on loneliness, because loneliness is highly correlated with disease. We, faulty as it is, need to support the family while we develop alternatives to it. We need to follow the examples of the other wealthy Western nations who support families and avoid the murders and dissolution of people in society that we have in the United States, particularly the dissolution of men who can no longer support families and who resort to violence because they're not allowed tenderness and need an emotional connection aside from women who are their sex partners who increasingly desert them. 70% of divorces are initiated by women now. Interesting, since in 1960, 75% of divorces were initiated by men. But women's greater independence, forced on them by the labor market, has changed things, and men are in such trouble. Last year, 1917, handguns, men with handguns, killed 48 people in Japan, 34 in Great Britain, 21 in Sweden, 52 in Canada, where many people have guns for hunting, 42 in West Germany, and 10,728 in the United States. The only nation that has at least a monthly mass murder. Mass murder happens when people fall apart. And male people, particularly in the United States, whose role has changed and who don't have support in connecting and having feelings and working through them, even those third of American veterans who come back from Iraq and Afghanistan who kill themselves, and men kill themselves much more frequently than women, they have no way of processing what they've seen and felt during the war. And their way of bonding with other men in combat is gone because they're home, which is where they fall apart. All of these things and the absence of family wages, which were given only to whites in a country that at that point was, until the 70s, was overwhelmingly white, they're all collapsing. Women are more empowered because we have jobs we didn't have, because we had a women's movement, and because when our marriages dissolve, our primary emotional relationships, which are usually with other women, continue, or with children, that continues, or with relatives, that continues. Children are terribly neglected in the United States as a result of the failure of the family. 42% of children are born outside of a marriage, and at least a marriage often guarantees that at least two people will have something to do with that child. The US government, unlike the governments in all the other wealthy industrialized countries, is not supporting families in spite of congratulating ourselves for being child-centered and having family values. Well, what do these other wealthy nations do that we can do to support families? We could provide paid maternity and paternity leaves. We're the only Western nation and one of 3 nations in the world who don't give a paid maternity leave. The other 2 are Papua New Guinea, Oman, and Somalia, hardly on par with our wealth. Free health care we should give, which all the other Western industrialized countries give, including maternity care. Pediatric care that's free and that's given at schools, so if there are signs of child abuse in the examination, it's not up to the pediatrician paid by the parents to reveal that child abuse and do something about it. Family leaves, which everyone else has. Paid vacations. The United States has the least vacation of any industrialized nation. Free, quality, and supported child care from daycare and infancy on, or very generous maternity leaves. In France, you have up to 5 years. And after 1 year, you get a slightly reduced rate, and after that, 50%. And the government pays for that, so it won't be up to your employer who would want to deny you of it, which is what women have to do in the United States for their 12 weeks unpaid maternity leave. Summer programs, after-school programs, affordable co-housing. There is co-housing in the United States. It costs a lot of money. Co-housing is where a whole apartment complex is bought, and there are big communal spaces as well as individual apartments, and they consist of people with and without children, but who all want to relate to children, and so that there's some kind of communality. On all counts, the United States is at the bottom on all family supports, or close to the bottom. In terms of child health, we are at the very bottom. We need these supports because we need to keep our society from further degenerating into the kind of desperation that mass murder shows. We need to provide those family supports while we explore alternatives to the nuclear family as ways to raise children and give each other love and support. Because the situation for both parents and children is desperate. 1 out of 6 children faces hunger. 1 out of 10 children has to live with their grandparents or other relatives because their parents can't take care of them. They've overdosed, they're junkies, they're just incapable of this huge burden of bringing up another child without support. We don't remember, and we don't have publicized the fact that at the turn of the century, there were 200 communities in the United States that were built as alternatives to the nuclear family. They were born out of the traditions of communitarian socialism, domestic feminism, and utopian religions. They created communal ways to raise children and be families. The best known are the Shakers, who had 18 communities that thrived from the 18th century until the 20th century. Children there were not reared by biological parents, but by people the community chose who wanted to raise children together. There were in the United States the Owenites, the Amana Collective, for which Amana appliances still survive even though they're not produced collectively, Oneida, Shakers, and 200 others. We don't learn about those in history, and we ought to. These were successful experiments. Capitalist dominance and also the lure of the example of the Soviet Union having a revolution in 1917 meant that people didn't try to have revolutions with these alternative communities. There are, around the world, many successful alternatives to creating nuclear families, ones we don't hear about and are even hard to find on Google. Some of them that are highly successful are those inspired by Dr. Emmy Pickler, a founder of warm, creative orphanages that began in Hungary, where they had up to 5 people taking care of a newborn and creating the bonding with them, and then small groups that sustained each other and created fine people as they grew older. Those Pickler orphanages still exist in Hungary, Ecuador, Belize, Nicaragua, and El Salvador. Russia still has the Kitez method of adoptive parents raising children in a community together. In the past, in Russia, one of the most successful experiments of all time happened after the Russian Civil War, where an educator called Anton S. Makarenko started children's colonies of hundreds of children that created their own, children of all ages, that created their own uniforms there, their own clothes, in their little factories they operated there, their own food. There's a 3-volume work called The Road to Life by Makarenko, which describes that. And there's also a film called The Road to Life. So there are alternatives to the nuclear family that are not only possible, but can be successful. And that knowledge is repressed. For now, we need to support the nuclear family, which is crumbling, abandoning millions of children, and torturing parents who can't provide for their children. We need, in the long run, to develop alternatives, to give people choice. It's not necessity, choice. Choice of how to raise children. It's cowardice for us to assume that which isn't done now can't be done, and can't be done on a grand scale as needed. We're not cowards. Our courage is needed here too. If you want a bibliography of some of these sources, ask me later, because I have a small bibliography here for people who want it. Thank you.
The question was, why was the white male family with the Jane Spotton dog used as the example in Professor Wolff's talk?
Well, I actually used it for several reasons. One is just the history that until very recently, this is a country that pretended that everybody was white and that everybody who wasn't white wasn't there, by and large. And large numbers of Americans are working very hard to keep that tradition alive, even now. So partly it's that. Partly it's because of the role of white men in making Trump the president of the country. If you look at the numbers of the voting percentages, that's his most enthusiastic audience, white men, and particularly those that feel this collapse of the family and blame the appropriate scapegoats for it. So that was another reason, and partly also to provoke you, to provoke you into seeing this process, because this family values veil dropped over American politics has to be understood for the ploy that it was, and for the role that it played in allowing conservatives to have a dominance within the Republican Party and the Republicans to have a dominance in the larger political scale. Their fundamental problem is they are the party of big business. They always have been, and they are the party of big business. That means they're isolated from the mass of people unless they find a way, to quote Gramsci, of making a hegemonic bloc with masses of people. So the job of Republican politicians is to go and find those sections of the mass population that they can link in with the business community. Fundamental Christians, that's a good one. Families falling apart, that turned out to be a better one. And so that's their job. White supremacists, sure. Anybody and everybody to diminish the natural tendency for the mass of people to identify more Democrat than Republican, given who they are. That's their job. If they succeed, they're the government, and if they fail, they're not. They all understand that. The only question is how you balance the subservience to business with the theater of interest in the mass of the right wing. And Trump understood that it's time to shift over to the mass of the far right, because otherwise the game is up. And so he did that. Mr. Bush didn't understand that, and we barely remember him, which is not a bad thing. I'm not against that, but it's...
Great, so the question, I'm just going to repeat, probably not as well as you asked it, but was about the relationship between capitalism and marriage, and if marriage should be preserved, and what the role is between marriage and family, the structure of family and the role of marriage. I hope I got that accurately.
Well, marriage, as family breaks down in the United States, marriage has completely broken down. 50% of first marriages, 60% of second, and 70% of third marriages end in legal separation or divorce. But people who don't have money to fight over just split. They don't necessarily bring the law into their breakup. And I think commitment is important, and I think in a better society and a socialist society, people could declare their commitment and say, I will love and support you till I can't stand it anymore, and I'll really try. Because marriage was a way of making sure that this nuclear family unit was responsible for children.
Right.
And love was supposed to go with marriage, and sex was supposed to go with marriage. And it used to be a big shame to have children outside of marriage. Now 42% of children are born outside of a marriage, no big deal. That ideal nuclear family, which started with the dissolution of feudalism, is no longer viable. Men can't support their families. There is no one home with the children. In the United States, there isn't a quality child care substitute. And so capitalism has destroyed the family because it's required everyone to work. And it's very clear, Marx was right in the Communist Manifesto. They have. One of the testimonies to the changes in terms of marriage being sort of a holy union is that the pussy grabber in chief there has a wife who is the only first lady ever, never interviewed. Nobody says, whoa, where is she? Michelle Obama was always questioned. They were talking about her biceps were too big and she was this and that, but she was in the public eye. That Melania is nowhere is remarkable. That this marriage, this symbol of the marriage, has dissolved, largely without comment. Very interesting. And I think the expectation of love and marriage continuing through a life is over. 75% of kids live with two people who weren't their biological parents in the first place. Between divorce and separation and people being born outside of a marriage, it's over. But I do think it's important to have consistency. That's why I think we should have these excellent child care centers the way they have in all the other Western industrialized countries. Because children need consistency and support, and capitalism has destroyed it.
I'd like to add to that, actually, that I just had a baby. She's 2 years old, and we have two parents in the home, and it's still not enough. It's really just not enough. Our families, as I said, I had to move in order for work out of Syracuse. My husband's family is in Philadelphia. Again, I guess he could have stayed there, but the nature of his work brought him to CUNY, Brooklyn College. You can't just get trained to be a professor and then expected to get a job in your hometown. That just doesn't work that way. So, even two isn't enough. It really does take a group. And I think it's important to note that here in New York, Bill de Blasio has made... I'm just waiting for 4 years old because then there's free childcare
right.
or free, so there are movements among even the most progressive politicians to incorporate some of these ideas.
And I want to add to that, which is that during Reagan's term, there was a bill that had been passed to have Head Start for everyone in the United States. Yeah. And he vetoed it because it interfered with the rights of the family. It was on that basis that public education was fought by the churches and by the right wing under the cloak of the church, that it interfered with the family to send them to public education. That's an old one. And the only people who seem to think that it is possible are the very rich, whose families tend to stay together. Marriage is a luxury good in the United States now. And Sheryl Sandberg, in her very good book, Lean In, says it is possible. She and her husband could do it. They could bring up their kids, but she didn't mention they had 9 servants. That really helped.
And then the husband actually died.
Yes, he did.
That's unfortunate.
So they just had to deal with the servants.
Okay, good. I'm glad we have so many questions, and we will get to everyone. Yes.
Julianna, could I just...
yes, of course.
There's also a link here to the Me Too movement and all that represents. When the family broke down, if you remember my story, and the women have to go to work to sustain the standard of living and all of that, you now you inject masses of women into the hierarchy of the capitalist enterprise. And given where most of them go, they end up in subordinate positions. Not too many of them end up on the board of directors or in the high levels of management. So now you have an influx of women who must work to sustain the family and who are dependent underneath the control of men in a very hierarchical structure. That's a recipe for what we got. And it's not just the famous Harvey Weinstein, all that. It's the little, at every rung of the capitalist enterprise. One of the reasons some of us are advocates for worker co-ops is because if there were the premise that the workplace should be organized, one vote, one person, everybody equal on a horizontal level, then you might bring the women into the workforce without this immediate subordinate position where people whose families are falling apart so they don't have a successful relationship at home start imposing it on subordinates where they work, which we hear about literally on every day. So even that is linked to this whole process.
Oh, so is the idea of women's liberation and a propaganda-based
There's an unintended consequence.
Unintended consequence. Harriet?
Well, I think Bernays was Freud's son-in-law who wanted to use psychology to make people buy stuff. The family has always been something propagandized. During World War II, Rosie the Riveter was the female model. That you go out and you work because they needed women in the factories. At the end of World War II, that was considered sacrilegious and a damage to your family because they needed women at home to free jobs for GIs. The family has always been manipulated, and what is a family and what is feminine and what is not feminine has always been manipulated by the powers that be, either in order to sell or in order to coerce men and women into roles that fit the capitalist system at the time.
But it doesn't seem logical that someone would go, I know what's going to help our country, destroying all of our families. How can we make
No, it's an unintended consequences. Look, the idea is you make money. As someone once said, the capitalist will sell you the rope to hang him. Mm-hmm. And the idea was to make money from cheap labor, go to countries where there's ecologically no standards, no safety, and pay people $1 to $3.50, which is the Asian, range of wages, instead of $25 an hour in a union wage. Okay, the idea is make money and let the chips fall where they may. And our government was not restrained. We didn't have the communist and socialist trade unions they had in France and Germany and Sweden banning outsourcing. In Sweden, if you want to outsource, you have to get every single worker that works for you an equivalent job in Sweden. In Germany, if you want any public money, people want breaks and so on, you have to have community representatives, the union representatives, and so on. They don't have outsourcing, and they are the most strong economy in the Western world.
I'd also like to chime in that from my own generation, the idea of not working and just being a mother is actually something that's completely, you have to feel strong as a person to be okay being a stay-home mom. It's the opposite. There's a real self-confidence hole when people decide they want to stay home with their children. They feel that society is not. That's not how they were raised, that's not how.
Right, unless you're in the 1%, where women who were highly educated and well-paid stay home and manage those people who take care of their children.
I'm not in the one. Yes, and then we'll go up. The question is, what's the effect of educational privatization and how the hedge funds are basically vulturing off our children in order to get state funds? How is that affecting the family?
Let me link it back to the story I tried to tell you before. If capitalists after the 1970s attack these two institutions, the family, the way we've discussed, and the state, one of the effects of attacking the state, cutting the taxes and all the rest, is the destruction of public education in the society, starving the teachers, starving the school systems. They haven't got the supplies, they haven't got adequate books. The whole story that, has come to a head with the courageous and very important historical action of the West Virginia teachers and the others that have fought back now, and which are changing this situation, and they will change it. But up until then, up until this year, it's been a downward spiral. And I think you need to keep that in mind to respond to this important question. The public education system in this country is being destroyed. And again, this is not some conspiracy to destroy. Capitalists don't need an American population educated the way they once did. They're moving out. The chairs are not being funded in American universities by American companies. They're being funded in Hyderabad and Beijing because that's where they need them. And those engineers will be available just as well trained, just as well developed at half the price. And so the American education system is, like everything else, no longer fundable, no longer interesting. Just like maintaining the old family isn't interesting, isn't necessary anymore. Don't need it. Okay, in a collapsing public education system, you're going to have people, particularly if they have some money, or if they have some ambition for their children to make it, they're going to be looking at a declining system and saying, I can't subject my children to this. I don't want this. Well, where the hell are they going to go? The answer is a private school. It's been the answer a long time, and now with the acceleration of the destruction of public education, in comes a profit opportunity. Let's create the place to which people can retreat if they have the desire and the money to have a charter school, to have a private school, to have a you name it. And of course, the hedge funds and the private venture capitalists smell a desperate population that has to do something for their children, can't leave them in the collapsing public school system, and so are willing to come and pay, and now money can be made. And you have this merger in which capitalism, like a vulture, eats the destruction of the public school system, which it brought into being. It's the same logic as this system goes. And for all of you, really, you are living in a capitalism that has abandoned you. You've got to understand that. Otherwise, you'll be walking around like so many of our fellow citizens without clues to what's going on. Capitalists have done what they've always done. They've moved to where the money is to be made, and it isn't here anymore. We're too expensive as a working class, and they've moved out. They're either going to replace us with machines or with immigrants, or they're leaving. And that means for everybody who isn't in one of those things, you're screwed. And you're going to wallow in the disconnection and in the dissolving of everything you thought was your birthright. It's only a question of how far they can go before Americans go, wait a minute. And that's what the West Virginia teachers figured out.
What could they, if a school shooting, God forbid, should happen at a private school, could you sue the school for not protecting your kids? I mean,
Yeah, absolutely.
why can't we sue the public schools for not doing the same thing? Don't you think the states would then want to preserve their tax money and maybe do something?
They might.
I got ideas here, people. Yes. So the question is, given that there's not a two-parent home and the dissolution of the family, as we've discussed already, what do you see that portending to the fabric of society? And you made reference to the shootings that are going on, et cetera. The quality of our society and our culture.
That's what I'm talking about when I talk about alternatives. First, supporting the nuclear family, as they do in all the other Western industrialized countries, and creating alternatives. Because, oh yeah. You have to create alternatives. First, you have to support the family, the way they do in every other Western industrialized nation. England is bad at this too, but at least they give health care. But you have to have childcare from 0 on. You have to have after school and summer care. You have to have health care. You have to have help. Parents can't do it. And it doesn't matter if they're biological parents or adoptive parents, children need enormous amounts of care, and they're not getting it, and they're lost. And people need relationships. They need connection. The loneliness here is terrible. Part of what a co-op does is allows people to work together every day. People who are out of a job, or people who are isolated in their work, like the Las Vegas killer who killed 59 people and injured many more. He was entirely alone, lived through gambling. And in the other phases, he worked as a realtor for himself and had several wives who he dumped along the way. And, you have a level of desperation. And so it doesn't matter about biology or not biology. These successful orphanages for the orphans that started during World War II were very successful because they replaced parents with people who know and care for children, which is very important since most parents don't have that luxury and don't have the sensitivity to who their children are. Yeah, well, one of the sad ironies of gay marriage is just as marriage is falling apart, they got a right to marry. But I do think that there are legal benefits in marriage. There are economic benefits in marriage. There's also a clear benefit in making a commitment to stay with someone rather than thinking, this one's no good, I'll get another one. But to knowing someone, to learning to care for someone, to working out issues between the two of you, and that doesn't have anything to do with what gender choice you are. That has nothing to do with whether you're a transsexual or homosexual or whatever. Well, if people don't want to support the institution, they're fine. The mass, for the first time in our history, the majority of people at what they call prime fertility age, 18 to 35, are not married. And they're not all unmarried because they couldn't find Mr. or Ms. or whatever right. They're not married because they don't see the point and because marriage had an economic base that, okay, we're ready to settle down and build a family. No more. There's no money in it. Marriage is a luxury good. And the top 1% has the greatest longevity in marriage.
Yes.
Julianna, could I?
Yes, Richard.
It's a very important question. I'd just like to add, I think there was a time, before the 70s particularly, when there was a kind of rule of thumb in capitalist corporations that marriage was good because it made the worker, assumedly a male, stable. You know, he had a home to protect, he had a family to raise. And so the capitalists felt they should support that. That would help them. They'd have a worker who'd come to work, wouldn't be drunk and whatever, wouldn't be carousing last night because he had to do the dishes. Right? Well, I mean, the basic idea. And I think capitalism is different. What? Take the garbage, yes. Capitalism has changed in all the ways I talked about, and they don't care about that anymore. They want 80 hours a week out of you. They don't care what your gender is or what you do with your sexuality or with whom. They are interested in one thing. Are you going to come at 9 o'clock and do the damn job and stay late and work a little bit on the weekends and have your email available and your texting at all times? The stability isn't there. The flexible workforce is what they want. And now your affective relationships with other people become more likely an interference. You're not going to be able to stay late because you have a relationship to sustain. Whether you're a man or a woman or what that relationship is, now becomes a competitor for your intensity. And so the attitude begins to shift. We don't need you to be stable. We need you to be available. And by the way, the working class is complicit without understanding it, because the implicit threat is, If you don't come, put your personal, intimate relationships second, third, or fourth priority, we'll find somebody who does. So, okay, you want time with your lover, your friend? Nice. We don't need you. We're going to find an intense person who either has no such relationship or gives it the low priority that shows we, your employer, are number one. It's a different universe corresponding to where capitalism finds itself, at least in this part of the world.
The question is, on the economic level, is spending money on things that support the family going to sort of be offset by the money we spend on, say, prisons or something like that? Will it be in our best interest? Yes.
Yeah, I'm
As
going
a
to
society.
put my hat on.
afterwards.
Yeah, my hat on as an economist, and I hope you bear with me when I tell you this. If you want this kind of calculation, I will produce it for you. If you want a calculation with the opposite result, I'll produce it for you. The belief that there is such a thing as a cost-benefit analysis that proves something is a fundamental philosophical mistake. You can't do that. No one has ever done that. Before I became an economist, I was a mathematician. So here's a mini lesson in mathematics. The costs and benefits associated with anything are infinite in number and go into the unforeseeable future. Therefore, to calculate what the benefits are and weigh them against the costs to decide if it's cost effective, that's a mirage. You can't do that. No one can do that, and no one has ever done that. That is, to use a technical term in mathematics, bullshit. But it's very important. I get paid, or I don't do it anymore, but I used to, and I was often offered good money, which is what economists are basically in it for, to do these things. They're done all the time because you believe them. So every time it comes up, one side hires its economists and the other side hires its economists. They get exactly the opposite results, which everybody understands. And the hope is that one of them has more money to spread its calculation across the population and thereby win than the other one. But it's the money that decides. It's got nothing to do with these crazy calculations, which are impossible to do. There is no basis for this. Don't be fooled. If you expect a number to solve these problems, you misunderstand the problem.
Well, isn't it also the case that are we going to be capitalists in order to decide how we want to run our society, right? If we're choosing by the bottom line whether people get childcare, health care, et cetera, then we're doing the same thing that the corporations did who destroyed my family. Harriet, I'm sorry if I...
Yeah, I mean, that's related to efficiency. Efficiency for who? Efficiency for what? Those questions are values questions which have to be added to any of these things and which makes cost efficiency silly.
I think that was a great question, though, and I think it really brought up some good discussion. I'm going to go here, yeah. So the question is, because there are so many things causing the dissolution of our society, when there is a gun violence incident in the United States, there is a jump to banning guns, and do you guys, and ladies, feel like it is a knee-jerk response to that particular crisis that's happening?
It would help. However, we have to look at who is violent in our society. It's men. It's the male role, which used to be the provider role, that has dissolved. And it's men who are in the most trouble. Women are empowered. We're working. We had a movement behind us. We're starting to get legislation. It's men who have not been helped either by the early feminist movement, I must say, and now to claim their territory and their right to tenderness, their right to protection, their right to kindness, their right to connection with other men and with women and with babies. And they are in terrible trouble. What is it? A third of our servicemen come home and commit suicide. Men commit suicide much more frequently than women. There's a kind of hypersexualization and a maleness associated with violence, so that people who are disempowered, as all the mass shooters are, and who are lonely, as they all are, think they can recapture their ascendancy, their dignity, their respect, and their manhood at the mouth of a gun.
Richard?
Yeah, I saw from your faces when I said something before that makes me want to say this again. We are surrounded by the signs, and this question about guns is yet another one, of a society falling apart. I mean, how long before we, all of us, begin to live and think with that as the explicit context? We pick up the newspaper every day and we watch a crazy person tweeting us crazy stuff, wanting to go backwards to white supremacy, finding something meritorious in all of that, you know, being fuzzy in his head about it. And we watch murders in our schools and in our communities on a scale that Harriet's statistics drive home to us. We're talking about the dissolution of the family. We're watching, by the way, just as a footnote, that the unity of the capitalist class, international unity, confronting the working class, is dissolving. Mr. Trump is attacking all the other countries he needs alliances with. There's costs to this. This isn't only theater. Is it partly a theater for his base? Sure it is. But I want to remind you, the greatest destructive wars in the history of the world were achieved among capitalist countries, World Wars I and II, that blamed each other for their internal difficulties, which is what Mr. Trump is doing. The difficulties of capitalism here, reflected in the shootings and all the other things, are now being blamed on foreigners. Immigrants who come from abroad, that was number one. And where is that happening? Every other country. Every other industrialized country is blaming immigrants. And now we have the next step, blaming the nasty foreigner with our tariffs, punishing them for their unfair behavior in the market. The market, it turns out, is unfair. Interesting problem ideologically, but we'll put it aside. It's blaming the foreigner. This is a society that's falling apart and is beginning to hunt for the usual scapegoats in order not to have the society do what I'm pleading with you to do, which is you're in a capitalism that is over. Every system rises, changes, and dies. We're living in a dying one, and the question really is only whether we're going to let it take us down with it.
Before the end of the panel, I would like to point out that harrietfraad.com, democracyatwork.info, and rdwolff.com is where you can reach our panelists. If you need me, I am at juliannaforlano.com.
Marxist feminist Monique Wittig wrote in her piece, "One is Not Born a Woman," about how the economic subordination of women contributes to the construction of womanhood itself. Showing that gender is, like capital, a social relation. How do we, on the left, make an economic critique of gender, basically?
You make an economic critique
Thank you.
of the capitalist system, and you make a critique of gender and look at what it has done. You look at how genderizing people means that women in the household for centuries produced use values in terms of emotional care, child care, food production, and cleanliness, and were considered doomed to do that by God because they had vaginas. And religion condoned that. All of the Abrahamic religions cooperated in doing that and creating the social construction of a woman to do free household and emotional labor to buttress men. and contributed to the genderizing of men and women. It was a collusion between the Abrahamic religions in rebellion from the matriarchal religions that preceded them, and capitalism and feudalism that needed these roles, and that in a liberated society, people are human and work together, and the social construction of gender is eliminated. In Sweden now, in preschools, they are not calling anybody by gender. They don't refer to him and her. They refer to people's names and other things because they want to get away from the genderizing of humans. By the time a child is between 1.5 and 3 years old, he or she learns what gender they are and some of the behaviors associated with it. I remember when my son, who grew up in a feminist household, some woman, he had long hair, it's very pretty, and a woman said to him on the block, "Wow, what a pretty girl." He kicked her immediately because the idea of being construed as female was so insulting. He was, in spite of me, he was already genderized by the society. That you need to create human beings as their own category. And capitalism uses gender. And in a society where people aren't used, you don't need it.
I would add the following, again, the philosophical. The minute you hear that something is fixed, be deeply suspicious. Fixing is a major way that ideology sediments itself into our consciousness. It's the way people with a particular point of view try to persuade you by saying it isn't a particular point of view, it's how it is. It is the objective world. Gender is of course it's a construct like everything else. It's not fixed, it's variable. It comes out of the ever-changing environment and the people who make sense of the world. Gender is a way of making sense of the people around you. You divide them. There's tall ones and short ones, and there's male types and female types, and there are people whose elbow is bent this way, and people whose, and you use some, but not all, and that varies from time to time, which ones you use, which are so terribly important. Now, it's terribly important that you have this genital rather than that, but at other times it isn't. The meaning of these things is something we are always making. And when you sense that someone resists it, they're holding on to their particular view in the oldest way imaginable by telling you it isn't a particular point of view, it's the act. That's just religion again. That's like saying we can't have a conversation because it's God who made this decision. It's not us. But it's always people with a particular axe to grind whose God works out to just happen to have their same point of view.
Well, thank you, everyone. I'm sorry we are out of time for questions. You've been an excellent and a very smart and wonderful audience. Thank you.